So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today or tonight for this discussion, which is based around the documentary Into the Light. We have a really exciting conversation planned with three wonderful panelists and a really special opportunity to hear directly from some of the film's participants. My name is Leah, and I'm the Knowledge Exchange Coordinator at Women's Shelters Canada. Women's Shelters Canada is a national organization that brings together 14 provincial and territorial shelter associations and more than 500 domestic violence women's shelters across the country. And we act as a unified pan-Canadian voice for systemic change to end violence against women, while providing leadership for collaboration and knowledge exchange among shelters and transition houses across the country. So I'm going to be moderating our discussion tonight with our panelists, and I'm going to introduce our panelists in just a minute. First, before I go much further, I do want to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. And this is a virtual event, and the beauty of that is that I'm sure there are people here from different places across Turtle Island. So please do feel free, if you want to use the chat to let us know where you're joining from. And if you don't know the territory that you're joining us from, I encourage you to take this as an opportunity to find out and to learn a little bit more about the historical and current context of the land you're on. So just a few little housekeeping notes before we get started. You can probably tell already that the only people who will have their audio and video on for tonight are the panelists. And we're just doing that to make sure that everyone can have the best audio and video quality possible. And it doesn't mean that we don't want your participation. We definitely do. So if you're here with us on the Zoom call, you can use the chat to say hi, to comment anything that you want to say. If you're joining us on the Facebook stream, you can use the comment section there on Facebook to do the same. If you have questions that you want the panelists to answer, and we would love to take your questions, we'll keep them for the end of our conversation tonight. You can put them in the Q&A box, which is just down along the bottom of your screen there, beside the chat box. And that really helps us keep track of those questions. They don't get lost in the chat that way, and we can make sure we get to all of them at the end of tonight. And if you're on Facebook, you don't have access to the Q&A box, but if you comment your questions, my coworker is on Facebook, and she will make sure those questions get to me. We do ask you, of course, to communicate respectfully throughout tonight's event, and any hateful or discriminatory language won't be tolerated. And finally, our conversation tonight will touch on domestic violence and other topics that might be difficult for some to hear about. So Caitlin, my coworker who's monitoring our chat tonight, is going to post the website and phone number for Crisis Services Canada for anyone who wants some support. So I've said a lot, so let's get into it. I want to start by just getting a sense of how many of you who've joined us today have watched the documentary already, Into the Light, that we're going to be talking about today. So I've just launched a poll there. You can use that to vote to let us know, yes, you've already watched the film, no, you haven't. There's no shame if you haven't. We just want to get a sense of who's here with us today. So some of you have voted. I'm just going to leave that up there for a few more seconds. And if you're on the Facebook stream, you can just comment, let us know whether you've watched it or not there. Awesome. So I'm going to end that and I will share our results here. So 40% of you have watched it already, which is amazing, and 60% haven't. So for those who haven't, hopefully tonight's conversation will be an encouragement to watch it, because it really is a wonderful film that's currently available for free on the National Film Board website, which is a really wonderful opportunity. So yeah, hopefully by the end of tonight, you'll be rushing over there to watch it. So as I said, we do have three really wonderful panelists with us tonight, and I'm just going to introduce them each quickly, and then we'll start getting into the heart of our conversation for tonight. And each of you, if you want to just give a little wave when I introduce you, we have Nathalie Cloutier, who is the executive producer of the French program's documentary studio at the National Film Board. And she has always championed a flexible creative process and supported a diverse group of auteurs, an approach that has yielded a number of bold endeavors. At the NFB, she's produced several interactive projects, including Here at Home, In Search of the Real Cost of Homelessness, a multi-award winning website about homelessness. In addition to her work on interactive productions, Nathalie has produced and co-produced numerous feature-length documentaries that have garnered attention both in Canada and internationally. And of course, she also worked on Into the Light. She was part of that team, and we're super happy she can be here to represent that side of things today. We also have with us Pat Vargas, who is currently the Director of Children, Family, and Community Service at Catholic Community Services of Alberta. Pat has more than 30 years of experience in the shelter movement, and currently she's overseeing the operations of 2 second stage shelters with a total of 30 apartments, and starting next year, she'll also have a 32-bed crisis shelter under her portfolio. She is also a founder and board member of the Global Network for Women's Shelters and the Inter-Americas Network, and she was recently appointed to the Alberta Human Trafficking Task Force. So thanks for joining us tonight, Pat. And last but definitely not least, we have Margarita Pintin-Perez, who is the Senior Coordinator of the Initiative to End Gender-Based Violence Against Immigrant and Refugee Communities at OCASI, which is the Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants. Margarita earned a PhD in sociology and a master's of social work. Her research is interested in violence, specifically examining the role of discourse and space in securing racial and gendered violence against migrant communities. She has completed research in Canada and in Mexico, with published work on feminist research methods and different forms of symbolic and structural violence. So we really do have a great group here tonight to speak about this film. Before those of us who are here on the call, jump into things, we have a really special treat. We really would have liked to have, obviously, the director of the film, the participants in the film join us tonight, but there is a bit of a language barrier there. So we've done the next best thing, and we're going to bring you some really special recorded video clips that they did just for this event that we've been able to subtitle. So I'm going to share my screen and play those for you. They're just a couple of minutes long, and then we will jump into our discussion. But we really wanted to make sure we could start by bringing their voices forward because it's their wonderful film that has brought us all together. So here we go.
Bonjour, je m'appelle Gentille M, Assih, réalisatrice du film Sortir de l'ombre. Sortir de l'ombre, pour moi, est un film d'espoir, de lumière, qui permettrait aux femmes comme Christiane et Aïssata, qui ont connu la violence conjugale, de reprendre confiance et de se dire qu'il est possible de s'en sortir, il est possible de guérir. J'ai voulu, en faisant ce film, montrer le cheminement de guérison que ces femmes ont entamé rien qu'en prenant la parole. Car la parole déjà permet de se libérer, de se prendre en main et aussi d'aider les autres. Donc cette sortie de l'ombre, c'est ça, c'est la générosité, c'est l'amour de l'autre et c'est l'amour de soi-même. Merci.
Bonsoir, je suis Aïssata Assih, diplômée en administration avec une spécialisation en finance. Je suis l'une des protagonistes pour le film Sortir de l'ombre. J'ai décidé de faire ce film-là parce qu'il m'a permis d'entamer mon processus de guérison, processus à travers lequel j'ai pris conscience du fait que j'avais renié beaucoup de choses qui m'arrivaient dans ma vie et que je pensais que c'était normal. Et je me suis rendu compte que je vivais de la violence en 2013, 2014 et le processus a été vraiment long pour moi pour m'en sortir. Je vous dirais que ça a pris au moins 4 ans avant que je m'en sorte, mais quand j'ai réussi à m'en sortir, la seule chose que je me disais, c'est pourquoi je ne suis pas partie plus tôt. Donc, à travers ce film-là, j'aimerais dire aux femmes qui subissent la violence qu'il faut s'en sortir, il faut partir de là, ne serait-ce que pour nos enfants, pour notre famille, pour ceux qui nous aiment. Nous ne devons pas rester dans ce pattern-là. Merci.
Excellent. All right. So if our panelists want to come online here, I wanted to start now that we've sort of heard from Gentille and Aissata about their participation in the film. They both mentioned that speaking out and participating in this film was part of their healing process, and for the other women who participated as well. And that's one of the reasons that it was important to them to make this film. So Nathalie, you've been kind of there for the journey of the film. I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about why the National Film Board felt this was a really important film to make and to bring forward.
Well, thank you very much, Leah. First of all, thank you for having us tonight, for showing the film, for talking about it. I have the privilege to work for the National Film Board of Canada, which, as you may know, is a public producer. It's quite a unique institution in Canada, but in the world also. A public producer means that the films we make, we don't make them for commercial reasons. We make them to give a voice often to subjects, issues, and even people that don't often have a voice. Of course, we're always looking to make the best films. So we're looking for, the cinematic qualities and approach to them. But in this case in particular, I have to say that in Gentille, we really had, in French, we say le jackpot. We won the jackpot because I had in front of me a great director. Gentille has made other long features before. And if you look a bit into her personal career, you'll see that she always tackles these very sensitive issues, very taboo issues. So when she came to me with this subject, first of all, of talking about women she found that were strong, she wanted to tell a story about strong women. And the conversation, though, went really rapidly into, okay, well, in these communities, what's happening? But between two women, we realized really fast that it wasn't only a question of, issues related to a particular community, and it could also resonate in a universal way. And these are the stories we're looking for. We're looking for stories that, will tell an issue, will tackle with it, but also will be able to give a sense of a story that resonates, universally. And it's unique. So this is why we went into this project. I think it really answered all these high quality, that we were looking into the productions that we make.
Yeah, for sure. And what you were saying about wanting to kind of tell the story of strong women, about strong women, I think that is one of the things that really comes through in the film. So often when we're talking about domestic violence or when we hear about it, the focus is on the violence itself. And I think we hear less often about that healing process. So, in the film, we do see, obviously, they've been through some difficult times, but there are also those moments of joy and laughter. So, Pat, can you maybe tell us a little bit, does that kind of resonate with what you see in your work with survivors of domestic violence and that healing process?
I first want to say what a beautiful film. I think it really captured the essence of that transformational change. I think as service providers, we do have to focus on the incident of abuse because it's important for us to raise awareness. I think we can hear women say, and I heard it again in this film, I minimized the violence. I was not aware of the danger it was in. And our job as service providers is really to do that, increase awareness. About strangulation, which can cause even death, concussions. How many women have been suffering from that for years and years, and that limit their cognitive? So we do need to find out about the violence, but it's not the whole story. That is only the how it starts and what we need to look at to keep everyone safe. But the real story is that what we saw there, the transformational change is sharing the hopes and dreams. So I think this video really captured that journey really specific, and I've seen it in many women from all parts of lives, from different communities and all different cultures.
And Margarita, what jumped out to you in this film when you were watching it?
Yeah, thank you, Leah, and thank you. It's an excellent film, and yeah, the focus on joy and solidarity. There's a sisterhood that's captured in this film is very memorable in the documentary. I remember this really beautiful moment that's captured when the women high five each other and they get up to speak and they're sharing with each other, and we witness in those moments that friendships, are these sources of empowerment, and they're bonds that are really working to break the isolation and the silence. And in the work of addressing gender-based violence, breaking isolation, breaking the silence, and having safe spaces to share and connect with others is really important. And so it absolutely resonates with, the work that we do as well, and the work where, speaking directly to immigrant and refugee communities, non-status women as well. And, these ideas of, healing and to be a survivor and to be a leader in your communities. I think that these are really popular terms sometimes, but they take on something else when you ask people, what does it mean for you? Like, what would healing look like for you? And we've come across, multiple times that we hear that, can it be joyful? Can there be like mutual care? Can there be places to be, join and participate on a soccer club, or places to dance? And I think that I'm really happy that you're opening the panel today with that emphasis and that question, because those are sites that are just as important to be supported and viewed as, strategic, as well as places where people find healing and support.
Yeah, for sure. And maybe we can talk a little bit more about that in terms of where, what the film tells us about where women turn, and specifically women who are in, immigrant, refugee, non-status communities. Where do they turn for support when they're going through something like this? We didn't see in the film, there wasn't a lot of conversation about maybe the traditional service providers you'd expect. We didn't hear about police or women's shelters, but we did see, like you said, Margarita, they're turning to each other. They really have that sisterhood. So yeah, what does that tell us about kind of where women turn for support, the different places you can find support? Pat, maybe I'll go to you first, and then Margarita.
I think women turn everywhere. I think we saw in the film, they're going to the churches, they're going to the doctors, they're going through to, their friends, their neighbors. It's really about how do we respond to that? And I think what was really interesting is that, we saw, in the film, what was really struck me that the doctor asked her about the disability, and was that caused by the abuse. And I think that is acknowledging that people are abused, because sometimes people want to look the other way, and that is not helpful. But so when you have somebody who acknowledges the abuse, right, but then also believes her when she says, no, it's not about that, but yes, I'm abused, or believes the woman in the stories and her lived experience. And the third one, I would say, when they comfort them, that doctor made a relationship because she believed her, because she comforted her, because she was worried about her well-being. And by virtue of worrying about women and caring about them, they start believing in themselves that they do matter. And so to me is, women are all out there telling you they're being abused. We just need to hear and respond appropriately.
Thank you. And Margarita, what would you like to add to that? Because I know you've been speaking with women across the country and groups across the country in your most recent project. So
yeah, I think, I echo what Pat says there. And I think this film really does make you reflect on like the dynamic role of community, I would say, and that you witnessed, right? And we know that communities and turning to each other as well, like informal supports, if we want to call it, right, where people are turning to each other, that's so important for refugee and immigrant communities. That's where there's meaningful relationships. It's, you know, lifelines and buffers to address gender-based violence. And at the same time, I think where people turn, and perhaps where they don't turn, tells us something really important. It's a really important part of addressing kind of the gaps, right? Or understanding where people are turning, and can we further support and strengthen those, you know, existing spaces. And I think that for our project, that is kind of where we go, where it's thinking, you know, can we be redistributing resources into these informal spaces, into these grassroots spaces, you know, that are spaces for safety, that are spaces for healing. And I think that that's kind of part of that conversation. I think that it allows you to reflect, like, where they're going is telling us a story, right? And we don't have to try to orient to another direction, but can we leverage those spaces that they're already going to?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's really interesting what you brought up around, you know, what does it tell us, you know, where they're going and where they're not going as well. Pat, does that resonate with your experience? Do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I think in particular, immigrant women. Look, you know, we as immigrant women don't want to be put under the lens where you're going to be scrutinized and where it's going to be pitting the other. Oh, that community is so violent. We've seen it done to the Indigenous community all the time. So yeah, we're probably not going to go to places where we're going to be othered, or where we're going to be told that, oh, well, it's your community is so violent. You know, at the same time, what was interesting is you have to be careful, because it struck me as one of the settlement workers, or some of the people who actually provide services to immigrant women, and the response was very much, you know, this notion that, well, if women didn't respond to this post, maybe they wouldn't get beat up, which, you know, it speaks to the part about, you know, you at every level you have to have people with race consciousness about what intimate partner violence is, and the dynamics of abuse, and how it is an inherent right to be free, live a life free of violence.
Mhm. Yeah, and I noticed in the director of the film, Gentille M, in an interview that she did with Radio Canada, I think earlier this week or last week around the film, you know, she spoke about not wanting to tell a story that would sort of contribute to stereotypes about immigrant communities, or make it seem like violence was kind of part of immigrant communities or something. So Nathalie, I just wonder, could you tell us a bit about, you know, was that a consideration in the making of the film? How did that kind of impact things?
Yeah, well, of course, yes, it was a preoccupation from the beginning. I think even for Gentille, and I don't want to speak for her, but I think that, you know, from what she's told me, it was also she could have been judged by her own community also for doing that. So it was risky on both sides. And we were also preoccupied that the way it was going to be picked up by media. We know, well, you know, we're in Quebec, and the whole situation with immigration, you don't want it to. So we really had to craft the film in a way that, but you never know. And then even you have to think about the distribution afterwards. So we did a lot of work also with, you know, with the press, the way we were going to talk about the film. But I'd say that I think that the way Gentille addressed it in the film is that when you tell a complex story, when you don't, you know, it's not only about the issue, it's about the issue, but these women are all different. Assih is very different from Christiane, very different from Chouchou. They're complex persons, you know, they're not like, you can identify to them. And it goes, and then, you know, I've been told so many times since the film has been launched, you know, oh my God, I can relate to them, but they're African, but I'm white and I can relate to them. I've been told that so often, and it's nice. So what's coming out in the comments now that I see online, and I have to say, I was fearful, because, you know, the objective was to have this issue be part of a conversation, and a broad conversation that would go beyond the communities, but it's happening. So it's like a double, how do you say that? We're winning on both sides, but I think it's because of the way the story was crafted. These are first of all women. I think that's what it is, and they're living a situation that many women could relate to. And it started with our conversation with Gentille, first day, that she came at the NFB, and we started talking, and I'm like, you know what, Gentille, I lived some conjugal violence, back in the years, like 10 years ago. So we could relate, and all of a sudden the mechanisms are the same, and you recognize everything. So we have a conversation, women to women. And then I think that, that really, she brought that to the film and the way the storytelling was crafted. So I think that's a way of going away from the stereotypes, is showing complex people and giving a more complex story, because we often have reports on TV. I'm sorry, my English is my English chip is not working tonight, but you have reportage on in the news, and they're fast clips, and then it's like, oh yeah, of course, these communities, they're violent, these people, they're coming here, and they're, because you don't have the time to just sit down and have a coffee with them, but you can do that in a film. You have time to live a bit with them. So that's how I think we tackled that.
Yeah, and that is one of the things the film does so well, it seems to me, is just it really spends time with the three women, and you feel like you almost know them a bit by the end of the film, and you're really seeing exactly that complexity of their journey. I saw a lot of nodding there from both Margarita and Pat. Do you want to add anything to what Nathalie has said there? I can go to Pat first and then Margarita.
No, I think she's exactly right. I mean, in having worked with my partners in the global network of women's shelter, where every country is represented, the stories are the same. The laws may change. There are some countries that have very little laws to protect women, and there are countries that almost give no resources to shelters. But the experience of women is the same. They all want to live free of violence, and they want to provide for their children, and they want to be safe with their kids. So that is, universal. And what sadly is also a pandemic is that violence against women is something that is global, right? It happens everywhere in every country. And there are women who also stand up for them and provide services and support them. So there's always pockets of resistance where there's oppression.
For sure. Margarita, did you want to jump in?
Sure. Yeah, I appreciate Nathalie's comments and Pat's comments. And, I think, Nathalie mentioned the complexity and being able to capture that. And I think something that is, parallel in some of our work, survivor-led work, centering, grounded in lived experiences, is that to tell a story this way, it's important that it center and it really be led by voices of people who've had that experience, and that it shows their full humanity. There's really beautiful moments of seeing vulnerability, the strength, strength. This is something we're learning so much in our own work as well, which is, leadership, strength. People are questioning these things, and interrogating it. And there's new ways of being strong or being a leader, which includes vulnerability. So I think that's something. And in terms of what you were mentioning about, the stereotypes, I think this is a really important point, because it speaks to how we name the issue and then name the issue of violence. And especially when we're thinking about violence within and against immigrant and refugee communities. And although, the slogan has been universally, violence impacts all women, we know that the interventions, we know the responses, we know access to supports and services is not equal, right? And so that's kind of where this is an important piece to make, to see in this film, like the communities and the places where people are able to access support and healing, and to reflect on that and think about, that there's an importance around, the constraints that are made there through immigration, for example, right? The constraints that are made and create conditions of vulnerability, of victimization through poverty, through isolation, through othering and exclusion. So when we reduce violence to culture, and this is what we're avoiding, we're trying to challenge this, in signaling out a particular culture or a community and suggesting that they are more inclined to violence, you know, that's a part of racialization. That's a process, right? So it's kind of, you're introducing this other layer to all of this, right? When we talk about it, it's stigmatizing a community, and in turn it's marginalizing a community, which makes it even harder to access supports and services. So I think a lot comes up with that question when we unpack it. And I think that it's great to hear, like Nathalie mentioned, that it comes with, you know, ways to contextualize, maybe ways to facilitate conversation after watching these types of documentaries. I think that's really important so that you can understand the context and you can understand this important element of like naming and thinking about violence.
Yeah, and picking up on what you're saying there about people have different access and the systems that are at play there. Another in the same article with Radio Canada, another quote that from Gentille was just talking about how it's not, violence isn't sort of natural in these communities, but the process and the system of immigration can be so complex. It can create so much stress and destabilization that violence can kind of come from that stress and that instability. So Pat, maybe you can speak a bit about, in your work with survivors, how have you seen that play out, or some of those systemic kind of factors and barriers?
Well, certainly women with no status are, really impacted by domestic violence because, we had the experience of one woman who, was in a domestic violence situation, of course, and children's services removed the child. So they had to separate. Well, she was a non-status. So she had two choices: leave your child behind or go back to where you are, from where you're from. And who's going to do that? Who's going to force a woman to leave? But then you force her to be in a condition of, charity, because you can't get any supports for her. She can't work. She can't get social services. So you are really leaving her in a condition of poverty and in a condition of really a beggar, because you're not changing your policies to provide the services, or to change it to understand that you're asking a woman to leave her child behind, a 9-year-old girl. Like, they're not going to do that, and we're not going to force her to do that. We are going to support her. I mean, now I'm glad to see that things have changed a little bit, and we were able to get some status for that woman. But certainly that, when sponsorship, we know that sort of system has always created a vulnerability of being abused, or you're at the mercy of somebody who's making up stories. So yeah, I think the lack of ability for the government to see that women who are immigrant, they need to be supported, they need to have their own status, they need to have access to their information, and and we need to protect them because they are more vulnerable.
Awesome. Yeah. And Margarita, did you want to jump in there, or I wasn't sure if you were going going to speak or not. No. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I can just, Pat, I echo like what she's saying is really important, because those are real structural barriers. And it's, we're especially working within immigrant and refugee communities. It's inherent in the immigration policy, right? We are increasingly becoming a country that the available pathways to Canada are precarious, and they're temporary. And those create conditions for vulnerability to victimization, and it shapes the forms of violence, it shapes the experiences of violence, and in turn it's also shaping responses.
For sure. Yeah. And I think, and this is maybe the last question that I'll pose, and then I see we do have some from the audience, so we'll start going to those questions. And so if other people have questions, feel free to be putting those in the Q&A while we're going through this last piece here. But I think we've spoken, the different things we've talked about, there are these barriers that you've just spoken about. And then we did also touch on, women are still, of course, finding places to turn. They're finding support in each other, in that sisterhood, and sort of moving along on that healing process. So just wanted to kind of wrap up this segment of our conversation by hearing from each of you, we are in the middle of the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence right now. And of course, we know that COVID-19 has just aggravated the existing kind of challenges and issues that were there with violence against women. So for people who are listening in today, people who are here with us, what can they do about these issues, about the things we've talked about today, or what could they do to support someone they know in this kind of situation? And so maybe I'll go to Pat first and then go from there.
I just think that we need to promote, what I call the ABC, which is acknowledge abuse. We need to believe the women, and we need to comfort the women, whatever that looks like. We need to comfort them. And we also need to remind people shelters are open. They can listen to you. They have a crisis line 24/7. We have never gone on lockdown. We've been working from then since the pandemic started. And so has everybody in the global network with, all the agencies. I think be more attentive, because when in lockdown, we know that women are way more vulnerable and it's hard for them to get assistance. And so, really it's about the neighbors, it's about us paying attention and keeping connected with those women. And I think allowing women to have their own agency and decide when they have to leave. It's not easy for everybody, but I think it just journeying with those women and being there as a support is the most important thing that we can do.
Thank you. I love that ABC. It's very good to remember. And maybe Caitlin, who's my coworker here on the chat, can also share in the chat the link to sheltersafe.ca, which if you are looking for your local women's shelter, you'll be able to use that site. There's a map there to find if you or someone does want to contact one of the shelter crisis lines. So maybe I'll go to Margarita next.
Yeah, and this is a really great question, and Pat did such a good job to kind of, provide some examples of ways in which, just even starting at a basic level, right? And I think we've had earlier conversations where there's this push for more like bystander kind of movement and work within the sector, within the anti-violence sector, and the emphasis there, and I think it's really important, is that like, not everyone will be able to be this hero, for example, to occupy that role. But there's something so important about knowing that this is an issue that impacts all of our society, and that the awareness. So this kinds of 16 days of activism against GBV, like this is, it holds a real important political capacity, and it's about creating awareness. It's like sharing. There's different places. We're all playing a different role in this. And I think that, for example, the types of films that we're talking about today, the documentary, like that it becomes for some people, it's a conversation starter to talk about this, to gain awareness, because that's where we do need to start. And just to learn from there, again, kind of ways in which you can be a bystander, you can be a community member. I mean, as in someone that, might know about resources, or that can act in that way of, also believing, as Pat said, which is a really important place. And I think that something that we try to emphasize, at least in our own work, is we're really trying to create networks that includes community members, that includes survivors of gender-based violence, that includes service providers. So different people coming together is important, because that's when you really see, that this, as I mentioned, it's an issue that's impacting us all. And so we all kind of hold a responsibility to this work.
Definitely, yeah. So Nathalie, maybe I'll just come to you for the last word on this, and particularly, as people are watching the film, is there something you want them to take away from the film, or a message you hope they take away?
Yeah, this panel is so interesting. I mean, we have to do this every day for, the next year. I think that what I've learned through the film a lot, and I felt strongly even before, I think, it's a film about friendship also and being there. And I think maybe you remember at the beginning of the film, Gentille tells Christiane, that she's mad at her because, she didn't know. And I think she's mad at herself. Gentille is mad at herself also because she didn't sense it. What I would say is that the more we talk about this issue, the more we'll be good at seeing the signs. And then sometimes it means you don't know what to do, but the resources you can give. Again, it's strange, tonight it's coming again, but it had happened to me, and somebody told me, well, you should call this number. And it was a man, he said, you should call SOS Violence. And really, probably that saves my life. So sometimes it's just like the knowledge and knowing, and it's being there, because these are processes that are often the women are being isolated, they're alone and everything. So if you just stay there, maybe they're not ready to have the help right away, but you're there. So when they'll need it, they'll know that they can call you, or but I think that if we can create that sense that this is not acceptable, like even in a society, and but it comes like one person at a time, and then we create that shield, and the more people have it, then these acts are not being tolerated more and more. But I think it's just one step at a time, one brick at a time, and we have to keep. These events are fabulous for that. I think, and even having the opportunity to launch this film and having conversation through the media, I'm just hoping that these are little steps, that can make a difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you've made so many great points there, all three of you, and it has been such an interesting conversation, which, like you've all said, I think is a really important piece of this process. And of course, having these conversations. And so there are quite a few questions that have come in here from people listening. So maybe we can shift towards those, and also, just help people kind of get into this conversation. So one of the first questions here, I believe from someone on our Facebook stream, maybe I'll ask you this question, Pat, with your experience kind of with shelters. Thinking about when a woman maybe comes to you for support and then returns back to her abuser, is there anything you try to do to prevent that from happening? Can you just talk a little bit about that situation?
Yeah, I mean, look, one of the things that we try to do is be really honest, that we don't have the answers to keep women safe sometimes. We try, but women are the best predictors of their lethality, they're best predictors of their abuse, and we don't have a crystal ball. So we try to journey with her. But we're also really honest about the danger she's in, and that's why we talk about safety plan. So it's not about judging women, because I'm not here to tell you how to live your life, because you need to look at who's going to feed you, whether you can work on that. These are complex issues. These are, it's not somebody who assaulted you and you have no feelings for. This is love, hate, fear, all mesh up into one, loyalty, my God. And so when we listen to the story, we do that with respect and with the most compassion, but also we need to be honest, because when a woman tells me that the tool of oppression is strangulation, I'm going to say, you're probably going to die if you go back to that relationship and if he continues to do that, because we have seen it. And so it's keeping it real. We don't have to pretend, that is a good option to go back to an abuser. What we have to say is, how can we keep you safe the best way we can? And this is how you keep doors open. This is how you keep the communication, the trust. You heard somebody in the film who said, I tried many times. It took me this many times to leave. If you're an immigrant woman, you have nobody here, maybe, your families, your support systems are back home. There's so many issues that, it is about respecting somebody's decision. It's about journeying with them. It's about making sure that they're safe, that the children are safe, and that the door's always open. So this is how you should provide the service, and this is how we try to provide the service.
Thank you. Yeah, and it just goes back to some of the conversations we had earlier this evening, just about the complexity of this process, right? And of that healing process and journey. Thank you. So we have another question here, and maybe Margarita, you can speak to this one first. Someone wondering about, supporting people who maybe they don't have legal immigration status here in Canada, so non-status women or people. How do you support people like that, and what resources are available? If you can just speak a little bit to that sort of specific situation.
Right. And I think that's a really important question. And, ultimately, no one is illegal. And it is, there's, as I mentioned before, I think inherent to our immigration system, and we have a history of this, is that it creates precarity, it creates the conditions for precarity. And increasingly, racialized migrants are entering Canada in ways in which the pathways that are available are temporary. And so, even within the status of having, permanent status, temporary resident status, that status is conditional. And so it can lead to situations in which people may become non-status in Canada. But what's important to know is that, a lot of programs and eligibility for supports and services may be conditional on someone's immigration status, right? Or even learning about some of those existing supports and services when you're a newcomer, immigrant, refugee community. And so it becomes really important to think about how are we collaborating across different sectors to make sure that we have awareness of how our supports and services work, what are our mandates, making sure that, especially like thinking frontline service work, service provision, and for example, within mainstream services of anti-violence work as well, making sure that we don't turn anyone away, right? And understanding what supports are available if the person arrives and, for example, doesn't have status, because what we know is that that's not a reason to turn away someone from shelter or from accessing supports and services. But what can be misleading or misinformation sometimes, we're all human within these systems that we're trying to navigate. We don't always know all of that. And I think that what really for me is emphasized there is that when you think about a particular group, so if you're thinking about non-status refugee immigrant women, their experience of violence, if you're thinking about that and then you let that inform and shape your services and supports, you'd have an eye on that, right? You would be thinking about, okay, well, what does that look like if someone arrives here who's non-status? How do we approach this, right, to make sure that people have access to supports and services and ultimately healing?
That's such a great point. Thanks, Margarita. Pat, is there anything you want to add to that based on your experience with shelters?
Just wanted to kudos to the Shelter Canada, because they bring us together how often, maybe once a month, to talk about some of those issues and to promote this notion that we need to provide service to everybody, and we navigate systems together, and we learn from each other. And so I just want to say that, the Shelter Canada has taken a real leadership in making sure that shelters are providing the services, but also are supporting each other in navigating, because obviously our goal is to move women forward. Way more difficult if you have precarious status, where you have no access, but we're still doing it. We're still, that woman that was with us, she was with us for 3 years, 4 years, because you know what? We don't have to, we can be flexible. We can do this, right? And we of course became the advocate, and we move forward, advocating the government, and that's our job. But yeah, women can navigate the shelter world. That's what we're here for.
Great, thank you. We have quite a few more questions, so we'll maybe start going through them a little bit more quickly. Although, there's lots of interesting stuff coming up here, so I don't want to rush. But there is, so there's a kind of a comment question here, someone who, found what we said earlier about that relationship between Christiane and her doctor, who, kind of asks or checks about the injury. Is that from from domestic violence? And the different places women turn. So this person is, saying it does make them think about how damaging a biased or stereotyped approach could be, and what's being done to avoid that. How can services be adapted to women from all different places? And maybe I can connect this to some of the comments in the chat. There was one suggestion of creating Afrocentric counseling for women from Africa that can kind of manage those cultural differences, religion, beliefs, all these different pieces. So I'm not sure who would like to speak to that first. Maybe Margarita, and then we'll see if Pat wants to jump in.
Sure, yeah, I think that's a really great question. And what I hear in that is that, and there's work happening across different sectors as we're challenging like the universality, let's say, of who we imagine as a victim of violence, and ultimately trying to think and imagine of what our unique needs, the unique needs of certain communities. So the work really is challenging. I think some of that, maybe we've had an over-reliance, for example. Where are some of these biases taking place? An over-reliance, for example, on the criminal justice system or certain kinds of social services which frame responses of violence within a certain framework. So it's very helpful to have spaces that are unique to meet the needs of immigrant and refugee communities. It's very helpful also to think about, when you're prioritizing or supporting work that is survivor-led in certain communities, then we're hearing from people, it's grounded in certain lived experiences. So there's some self-determination in those conversations around how the programs look and shaping that. I think those are ways in which I can think more high level, that there's ways of challenging some of those biases that might come out in everyday practices.
Pat, is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, only that there's no religion or culture that condones violence against women. There's only systems. And so, yeah, you can come from a system that's very oppressive, or, traditions maybe that are very oppressive, but there's always resistance. And so to me, as I agree with Margarita, though, that, having diverse groups providing services, it just, makes people feel better, like there's a level of understanding. But I also want to clarify that it's not like, oh, we need to provide, they need to provide their own service because, they're people. Like, again, there's nothing in any culture that accepts gender-based violence. They are systems that do not support women. But again, there's a lot of women doing a lot of work in those areas.
Yeah, and picking up on that piece about systems that you've both mentioned, we do have a question here also about how, the Black Lives Matter movement has revealed police abuse against Black men and Black people in particular. And so can that be an issue that prevents women who might be, maybe the abusive partner is a Black man, that fear of police, does that prevent them from asking for help in some circumstances? Either of you can answer that. Maybe Pat first.
Yeah, you know what? We know even phoning child welfare, you think about it twice, because the amount of people that are taking, because that lens is so colonial in a way, built on those traditions, that the responses are going to be very oppressive. And so Black lives, of course, women are going to be scared, because women want the violence to stop. They don't want necessarily to, have their partners in jail. And I'm saying we have to hold people accountable, but I think we also need to question the systems that have an overrepresentation of Indigenous people and overrepresentation of Black people in different areas. I think we do need to question that.
Margarita, did you want to add anything?
Sure, yeah, I totally agree with Pat, and what we hear also in different communities, it's that calling the police doesn't always feel safe for some communities, right, where the communities that are already overly policed. So the over reliance on the criminal justice system, that doesn't always work. And then I'm thinking also, among immigrant and refugee communities or people with precarious status. And there's also like fear of deportation, for example, right? Like fear of deportation if you contact the police, or so it really brings up kind of, you know, not other systems. And I think it also highlights for us in our work too, we emphasize that it's not, it brings up not just the violence within, but the violence against communities. And that allows you, when you think about violence against certain communities, it does force you to kind of expand your thinking around gender-based violence and think of all of the, think of it at, you know, the systemic level, the structural level. So through immigration, through the criminal justice system, like other ways of making sense of these forms of violence against certain communities, which in turn, you know, those other maybe more mainstream traditional sites of seeking support and help or intervention are not as easily available.
For sure. Thank you. And so, Pat, a question for you on a more sort of practical or interpersonal level here, maybe. When trying to help a woman who might be in a violent relationship, what should someone avoid doing? Are there things they could do that would put someone more in danger?
Don't be a hero. Really, honestly, when I see people who try to get in between, or I'm gonna go and no, phone the police. That's what you're supposed to do. If you see somebody and you suspect, give her a referral number and say, you know, I'm here if you need to talk, or you know this, or simply say, you know, I think something's happening to you and you should not live in here. Here's the number for the local, and you don't have to say anything else. But I think. You know, what I worry about is, why don't you just leave? Which is the worst thing you could ever say, right? You know, things like, you know, I would never stay in an abusive relationship. So then you're, oh, right away, you're better than her. Like, I mean, this is about compassion. This is about understanding. This is about, you matter and I care about you and I want you to be okay. Call me when you can, or here's the numbers for referrals. Don't start trying to counsel people, because you need to be, again, you need to know about trauma informed, you need to know about danger assessments, you need to, you know, it takes, I think, more knowledge, if you will, practice to be able to guide somebody. But you know, stories of abuse are deeply wounding for people who are telling you, but can also be really traumatic for you, the listener. You have to be also prepared to take care of yourself, right? And so I often say is that the best thing we can do is to tell women, again, comfort them, believe them, yeah, listen to them, but you don't have to have the solutions for them. So that would, I would say.
Awesome, thank you. And maybe one last question here quickly to wrap it up. And I'll go to you for this one as well, Pat, because I think you're sort of most connected to the shelter sector there. But just someone wondering, saying they'd like to be more involved. And so, you know, are there certain areas where shelters need help, or you know, communities where there aren't enough shelters or shortages of shelters? So what could someone who wants to be more involved do?
Be an advocate for the shelters. You know, we get a bad rap because, you know, we're overwhelmed. There's too many people trying to get in, and we don't have a lot of services because sometimes you have too many rules. Be an advocate. Let's do better. We are all trying to grow on this. Support your local shelter. Find out what they need. Sometimes they need volunteers. Sometimes they'll need somebody to drive the women. Sometimes they need somebody to go to their MLA and say, please don't cut the shelters, right? So there's many ways that you can choose to be an advocate for shelters.
Great, thank you. And so maybe we can just wrap up here really quickly. I'll just go around to each of you and you can just share one sort of last thought or final message that you want to leave people with today. So why don't I go to Nathalie first?
It's a good thing I'm first, and you know, these women will say great things after me. What can I share? I don't know. Well, I think that this talking about this issue really, and sin without taboos and without, shame also, because I think shame is a big part of domestic violence for women. And that's part of one of the messages I think Gentille wanted to get out, is that, there's no shame. And if you would have heard, we haven't heard Christiane tonight. She didn't have a chance to make the video, but one thing that Christiane said in one panel we had earlier this week in French, she said, I had to talk. I had to come out. I had to speak. It was stronger than me. And then that gave her strength. So I think that we have to build on that strength when we be inspired by that strength, and ourselves, go be able to talk about it, because there's no shame in living this, and there's no shame in addressing it publicly and addressing it, on the public space. So that's how I would. And I'm really happy to meet Margarita and meet Pat. I think you guys do great work. I'm admirative of you guys and of your work. And you also are, in the shadow, but bringing people into the light, bringing women into the light. So I thank you for that. Really, I'm really honored to be on this panel with you guys. Thank you.
We're so happy to have you here too, Nathalie. So thank you. Margarita?
Likewise, Nathalie, and thank you, Leah, for organizing and for having us here, and to be good virtual company with Pat as well. So, I mean, final words. I think, I recently heard somewhere where they were mentioning, like, there's an idea we might have in our mind around what advocacy looks like, or our action, and there's a really important part that is about the stories we tell, and the ones that are getting pushed, that we get to push and make sure that we're moving them forward. Because everything that we're talking about today, and what Pat was sharing as well, it's a story that needs to be told, and that needs to be centered, so that we can have, collective buy-in, because this is political, right? There's got to be a collective buy-in to really reinvest in resources and people and communities to strengthen the capacity of communities to respond to GBV. And I think today, thinking more about the communities that are, in this documentary, is thinking about, gender-based violence against groups that are at this intersection of gender, of race, of class, and immigration status. So I think that this is part of that really important work. It's about telling those stories, and we each have kind of a different expertise and perspective, but we're a part of that storytelling and pushing that narrative forward.
Absolutely. Thank you, Margarita. Pat, do you have a final thought you want to leave us with?
Yeah, I was reflecting on the film, and people always ask me, how can you do this job for 30 years and not get depressed? And I'm like, you know what? I live joy every day. I see the film in front of my eyes, from women transforming from the pain and sorrow of losing the relationship, or being hurt, or being embarrassed for their kids, being fearful. And then I see them move all the way to the joy and transformation. And I can tell you that all the women that we see, they want two things: to live a good life, to be able to provide for the kids, to be able to be a good contributors to society. That's all they want, and nothing left. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you, all three of you. And just a quick note before we wrap up here, because I see someone has asked if it's possible to watch the French panel from earlier this week. So Nathalie, I believe it's on the National Film Board's YouTube channel. Is that correct? And the website?
Yes, it is. Yeah,
Okay.
Exactly. You go on the National Film Board YouTube channel and you'll be able to watch it.
Perfect. Yeah. Well, so thank you, everyone who's participated tonight. Thank you to Nathalie and Margarita and Pat for these amazing insights, really thoughtful commentary that you've been able to share. And I hope it has, helped people think about the movie that either they've seen or they will see in a slightly different way. And we've had really great questions here tonight. So I want to thank everyone who's participated as well. These events really are sort of more fruitful when people are participating and asking those great questions. So thank you to everyone who's here. And I do want to just wrap up by thanking as well the director of the film, Gentille Assih, and the 3 women who participated, Christiane, Aissata, and Shushu. We wouldn't be here without them and without their courage and just that beautiful story that they've shared with us. So I just want to wrap up by thanking them as well. So yeah, thank you to everyone, and have a really wonderful rest of your evening to everyone who's here.
Thank you.
See you, Leah. Thank you.
All right. Thank
Great
you, everyone.
work.
Bye.